You have 30 seconds to tell me why I shouldn't buy your family's company and shut it down permanently." The words came out of my mouth with a calmness that surprised even me. Richard Ashford, my ex-husband, stood frozen in his $1,000 suit, his face pale as the marble floors of the courthouse where we'd just finished signing papers that would transfer his family's century-old real estate empire into my hands. The same hands he once said were too dark to wear his grandmother's wedding ring. You know what they say about karma, it doesn't just come back around, it comes back with interest. And sometimes, if you're really lucky, it comes back with $240 million and the power to rewrite every story they ever told about you. Justice isn't always served in courtrooms. Sometimes it's served in boardrooms, with signatures and stock transfers and the sweet sound of generational wealth changing hands. My name is Nia Montgomery, and this is the story of how I went from sleeping in my car with 3 hungry babies to standing in a glass tower, watching my ex-husband's family beg for mercy they never showed me. 3 years ago, I was scraping together coins for baby formula. Today, I own the building where Richard's law firm rents office space. Hey everyone, I hope you're having a beautiful day wherever you're watching from. Whether you're bundled up in the cold or enjoying some sunshine, I want you to get comfortable because this story is going to take you on a journey that'll remind you why you should never count anyone out, especially not a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to prove. Make sure to hit that like button if you believe in second chances and subscribe because trust me, you're going to want to hear how this all played out. But let me start from the beginning, because the woman standing in that courthouse today is not the same woman who walked down the aisle 5 years ago. I was 24 when I met Richard Ashford at Emory University Hospital. Fresh out of nursing school, full of dreams about saving lives and making a difference. I was working the cancer ward, and he was there visiting his grandfather who was getting chemotherapy. I remember thinking he seemed different from the other wealthy visitors. He actually talked to the patients instead of checking his phone, asked the nurses about their shifts, brought coffee for the night staff. Richard was handsome in that clean-cut way that screams old money, perfectly styled hair, clothes that probably cost more than my monthly rent, but eyes that seemed kind. When he asked me out after his grandfather recovered, I thought I was living in a fairy tale. A successful lawyer from one of Atlanta's most prominent families, choosing me, Nia Montgomery from Decatur, whose mama cleaned houses and whose daddy drove trucks before he died when I was 16. I believed in love conquering all. I believed that when you found the right person, their family would welcome you because they'd see how happy you made their son. I believed that skin color didn't matter as long as hearts matched. I believed that working hard and being good to people would earn you respect and acceptance. I believed that when Richard said, "I love you exactly as you are," he meant it. The first time I met the Ashford family, at their sprawling Buckhead mansion with its perfect gardens and inherited antiques, Richard's mother Caroline looked me up and down like I was something stuck to her shoe. "How interesting," she said in that particular Southern way that sounds polite but cuts deep. "Richard didn't mention you were so urban." His father barely acknowledged my presence, and his sister Melissa spent the entire dinner talking about their family's country club, making sure to mention multiple times how exclusive and traditional it was. But Richard held my hand under the table and whispered that they'd come around. He said love would win. When we got engaged 6 months later, I thought the worst was behind us. I thought once they saw I wasn't going anywhere, they'd make an effort. Instead, Caroline spent our engagement party introducing me to guests as Richard's little nurse friend and asking loudly if I needed help with the silverware since there were so many forks. But I held my head high because I had Richard, and we were building something beautiful together. When I got pregnant with triplets a year into our marriage, I watched him tear up in that doctor's office and thought this was it. This was our family, our fresh start, our chance to show his family what real love looked like. I had no idea that love could turn cold so quickly. I had no idea that the man who once traced my face with his fingers and called me beautiful would one day look at those same features with disgust. I had no idea that the family who tolerated me when I was just Richard's wife would see me as a threat when I became the mother of their grandchildren. The triplets were born on a snowy February morning, and they were perfect. Zara, Maya, and Kai, three little miracles with my dark eyes and Richard's stubborn chin. But as I watched the Ashford family visit the hospital, I saw something change in their faces when they looked at my babies. These weren't the blonde, blue-eyed grandchildren they'd envisioned. These babies had my thick curls and my warm brown skin, and suddenly the family that had barely tolerated me began to actively resent me. The comments started small. "Interesting hair texture," Caroline would say, running her fingers through Zara's curls like she was petting an exotic animal. "I suppose we'll need to find specialists for that." When the babies got older and started walking, falling down like all toddlers do, Melissa would sigh dramatically and say things like, "I just hope they don't become too aggressive." You know how some children can be. But it was Richard's transformation that broke my heart piece by piece. The man who once defended me to his family started making excuses for their behavior. "They don't mean anything by it," he'd say when his mother suggested I needed etiquette classes. "They're just old-fashioned," he'd explain when his father asked if I was sure the babies were his. Slowly, the criticism shifted from his family to him. I'd hear him on the phone with his business partners, laughing at jokes I couldn't quite make out but knew were about me. He stopped touching me, stopped looking at me during family dinners, stopped defending me altogether. When his law firm started losing clients because some of their old money families didn't approve of his mixed marriage, Richard began to look at me like I was the problem. The end came 3 years after the triplets were born. I was giving Kai a bath when Richard walked into our bedroom, the bedroom in the mansion his family had gifted us, which I now realized always came with strings attached. He was holding papers, and his face had that distant look I'd learned to fear. "This isn't working, Nia," he said, not even looking at me. "The firm is suffering, my family is unhappy, and honestly, I think we both know this was a mistake." When I asked him what he meant, he said the words that still echo in my head, "You're just not the right fit for this family. You never were. I need someone who understands our world, our expectations. Someone who can help my career instead of holding it back." That's when he told me about Jessica Walsh, a blonde lawyer from a good family who'd been understanding about his situation. That's when he told me I had 30 days to find somewhere else to live. That's when he told me the mansion belonged to his family, not him, and they wanted me gone. That's when I realized that the fairy tale was over, and I was about to learn exactly how far a woman could fall when she had no safety net except her own strength. But as I watched my babies playing in their bath, innocent and beautiful and unaware that their world was about to crumble, something inside me hardened into something stronger than love or hope or naive faith in happy endings. It hardened into determination. And determination, I would soon learn, is far more powerful than any weapon the Ashford family could use against me. The 30 days Richard gave me felt like 30 seconds. I spent the first week in complete denial, calling his office, showing up at the country club, begging him to remember who we used to be. I kept thinking about our wedding day, how he'd whispered in my ear during our first dance that he'd never loved anyone the way he loved me. How he'd promised his family's opinions didn't matter because we were building our own legacy. I was so stupid. So incredibly, painfully stupid. You have to understand, the Richard the first fell in love with wasn't the man who threw me out. That Richard used to bring me coffee during my double shifts at the hospital. He'd sit in the family waiting room for hours just to drive me home safely. When his grandfather was dying, Richard would find me during my rounds and just hold my hand, not saying anything, just needing someone who understood that grief doesn't care about your bank account. His grandfather Edward was different from the rest of the family. Maybe it was the cancer, maybe it was being close to death, but he treated me like a person instead of an inconvenience. During his final weeks, when the pain medication made him confused, he'd call me Angel and ask me to sit with him while Richard handled business calls in the hallway. That boy loves you something fierce, Edward told me one afternoon when Richard thought I couldn't hear. But this family breaks beautiful things because they're afraid of change. Don't let them break you, Angel. Don't let them break him either. I thought Edward was being dramatic. I thought love really could conquer everything, especially when Richard proposed to me 6 months after his grandfather's funeral. He did it at the hospital where we met, during my break, with a ring that belonged to his great-grandmother. I want to build something different with you, he said. Something better than what my family has. Something real. The engagement period should have been a warning. Caroline Ashford made it clear that she was handling the wedding planning, which meant I had no say in anything except showing up. When I suggested inviting my nursing school friends, she wrinkled her nose and said the guest list was already quite full with appropriate people. When I asked about having my pastor from my home church perform the ceremony, she laughed and said their family minister at First Presbyterian had been expecting this honor for generations. But Richard just squeezed my hand and said we could have our real celebration later, just us. He said once we were married, once his family saw how committed we were, everything would settle down. He believed it, and I believed him because I wanted to believe that love was enough. The wedding was beautiful in that cold, perfect way rich people do beautiful. 300 guests I'd never met, flowers that cost more than my mama's monthly rent, a reception at the country club where I was definitely the only black person who wasn't serving drinks. Richard's college friends were polite but distant, and his family friends kept asking me interesting questions about where I was originally from and whether I'd always wanted to be a nurse. But when Richard and I had our first dance to At Last by Etta James, and he sang along softly in my ear, I felt like maybe we really could make this work. Maybe love was enough. Maybe his family would see what he saw in me. Our honeymoon in Tuscany was perfect. For 2 weeks, it was just us, and Richard was the man I'd fallen in love with again. He took pictures of me at every vineyard, bought me books from local shops, spent hours talking about the babies we'd have and how we'd raise them differently than he was raised. Our kids will know they're loved for exactly who they are, he promised, tracing patterns on my skin as we lay in our villa overlooking the hills. They'll never have to earn acceptance. When we got back to Atlanta, Richard's family had surprised us with a house. Not just any house, a mansion in Buckhead, just 3 streets away from the family estate. We thought you'd want to be close, Caroline said, showing us through rooms that felt more like a museum than a home. This way the grandchildren can grow up properly. I should have seen the trap. I should have realized that a house you don't pay for comes with strings attached. But I was pregnant with triplets, working full-time, and exhausted. When Richard said the house was a gift, a way for his family to show they accepted me, I wanted to believe him. The pregnancy was difficult. Carrying 3 babies while working 12-hour shifts at the hospital left me drained and emotional. Richard started working longer hours at the firm, taking cases that required travel, missing doctor's appointments. I'm trying to prove myself, he'd say when I complained about feeling alone. I'm trying to show them I can provide for our family. But providing and being present aren't the same thing. When I had to be hospitalized for early contractions at 7 months, Richard was in Charleston closing a deal. When I called him crying because the doctor said I needed complete bed rest, he sighed and said he'd try to rearrange some things. His mother ended up being the one to drive me home from the hospital, and the entire ride she lectured me about stress affecting the babies and how I needed to think about what's best for everyone. The triplets were born 2 weeks early, and Richard made it to the hospital just as I was being wheeled into delivery. I'm here, he kept saying, squeezing my hand. I'm here. And for those magical hours when Zara, Maya, and Kai entered the world, he was completely present. He cried when he held them, called them perfect, promised them everything. But perfection doesn't last when you're under a microscope. The Ashford family had opinions about everything. How often I was breastfeeding, what clothes the babies wore, whether I was exposing them to too much stimulation by playing music during tummy time. Caroline hired a nanny without asking me, a stern white woman named Mrs. Patterson who constantly questioned my decisions and reported back to the family about my unconventional methods. "She's letting them sleep in her bed," I heard Mrs. Patterson tell Caroline one afternoon when she thought I was upstairs. "And she's using that ethnic hair product on their scalps." I tried to suggest something more appropriate, but she's quite stubborn. When I confronted Richard about it, he said Mrs. Patterson was just trying to help. When I said I wanted to do things my own way with my own babies, he reminded me that the house belonged to his family and maybe I should be more grateful for all the support. That word, grateful, started appearing in every conversation. Grateful for the house, grateful for the nanny, grateful for the family's patience, as I adjusted to their expectations. Like my existence in their world was a favor they were doing me instead of Richard choosing to marry me. The breaking point came when the triplets were 18 months old. I walked into the living room to find Caroline cutting Zara's beautiful curls with scissors, telling Mrs. Patterson that the hair was just too wild and needed to be manageable. My baby was sitting there crying while her grandmother mutilated her hair because it didn't fit their standard of acceptable. I lost it. Completely, utterly lost it. I snatched my daughter away from Caroline, screaming at her to never touch my children again. I fired Mrs. Patterson on the spot, told Caroline she was no longer welcome in my house, and called Richard demanding he come home immediately. When Richard arrived, he didn't comfort me or defend my right to protect my children. Instead, he sided with his mother. She was just trying to help, he said, that phrase I'd learned to hate. Zara's hair was getting out of control. "Mom knows about these things." "These things," I repeated, holding my baby girl whose beautiful curls were now choppy and uneven. "You mean black hair? You mean your daughter's natural hair that you think needs to be controlled?" That's when I saw it. That look in Richard's eyes that I'd been pretending wasn't there. Disgust. Shame. Like looking at me and our children reminded him of something he wanted to forget. "Maybe," he said slowly, "maybe Mom has a point about some things. Maybe we should consider what's best for them in this environment." That night, as I tried to even out Zara's hair while she slept, I realized something had fundamentally shifted. The man I married was disappearing, replaced by someone who saw his own children as problems to be managed instead of blessings to be celebrated. But I still believed we could fix it. I still believed that love was enough, that the Richard the first fell in love with was still in there somewhere, just buried under family pressure and social expectations. I had no idea that while I was fighting to save our marriage, Richard was already planning its destruction. I had no idea that Jessica Walsh, the blonde associate at his firm, had been helping him with more than just legal briefs. I had no idea that every family dinner where I felt excluded, every social event where I felt unwelcome, every conversation where I felt invisible was actually preparation for my elimination. I was still fighting for a marriage that had already ended. I was still believing in a man who had already chosen his family's approval over his wife's dignity. And I was about to learn exactly how far they were all willing to go to erase me from their perfect picture. The final blow came on a Tuesday morning in March, exactly 3 years and 2 months after the triplets were born. I was in the kitchen making breakfast when Richard walked in wearing his best suit, the one he saved for important court dates and family events. But instead of grabbing coffee and kissing the babies goodbye like usual, he stood in the doorway holding an envelope. "We need to talk," he said, and his voice had that cold formality I'd started hearing more often. The same tone he used with opposing counsel, with people who were obstacles to remove rather than problems to solve. Zara was in her high chair smearing banana on her face, while Maya and Kai played with blocks on the floor. Normal Tuesday morning chaos that I'd grown to love, the beautiful mess of family life. But Richard looked at our children like they were evidence of something shameful, something he needed to clean up. "I've filed for divorce," he said, placing the papers on the granite countertop like he was delivering a court summons. "My attorney says the process will be faster if we handle this civilly." The words hit me like cold water. Not the shock of surprise, but the shock of finally hearing something you've been dreading, but hoping would never come. Richard, we can work this out. We can go to counseling, we can. No. He cut me off with a finality that made my stomach drop. This marriage was a mistake, Nia. A mistake that's cost me clients, damaged my reputation, and disappointed my family. I should have listened to them from the beginning. That's when he told me about Jessica Walsh. Not an affair, he insisted, but a relationship that developed naturally while they worked late nights together. A relationship with someone who understood his world and could help his career instead of hindering it. Someone whose children would fit better into the Ashford legacy. Jessica's pregnant, he said, and I watched our entire life shatter with those two words. We're planning to marry as soon as this is finalized. I looked at my babies, innocent and beautiful, playing while their father destroyed their world. What about Zara, Maya, and Kai? What about your children? They'll be fine, he said, but he wouldn't look at them. You'll have visitation, of course. And I'll pay child support as required by law. But they can't live here anymore. This house belongs to my family, and they want it back. Richard, please. I was begging now, and I hated myself for it, but my children needed stability. They're your babies. Your blood. How can you just throw them away? His face twisted into something ugly. Look at them, Nia. Really look at them. Do they look like Ashfords to you? Do they look like they belong in this family? The cruelty in his voice when he talked about our children broke something inside me that I didn't know could break. This man who had held each baby when they were born, who had promised to love them unconditionally, was now rejecting them because their skin was too dark, their hair too curly, their features too much like mine. You have 30 days, he continued, pulling out more papers. 30 days to find somewhere else to live. The divorce will be final in 6 months, but you need to be out of this house by April 15th. 30 days? Richard, I have 3 toddlers and a part-time nursing job. How am I supposed to find a place for all of us in 30 days? That's not my problem anymore. He straightened his tie like he was preparing for his next appointment. I suggest you call your mother. Maybe she can help. My mother lived in a 1-bedroom apartment in Decatur and worked 2 jobs just to pay her rent. Even if she could take us in, there wasn't space for 3 growing children. But Richard knew that. He knew exactly how impossible this situation was, and he didn't care. I'll need the car too, he said, pulling out keys to the BMW he'd bought me for our 2nd anniversary. It's registered under the family's insurance. Jessica will need reliable transportation. How am I supposed to get around with 3 kids? Take the bus. People do it all the time. The man I married would never have spoken to me that way. The man I married would never have looked at his children with such cold indifference. But that man was gone, replaced by someone who saw me as an embarrassment to be discarded and our babies as mistakes to be hidden. They were building a case against me. Every missed meal because I couldn't afford groceries, every time the babies cried from exhaustion because I was working double shifts trying to save money, every moment of normal parenting stress became evidence that I was an unfit mother who couldn't provide for her children. With 2 weeks left before the eviction, I finally swallowed my pride and called my mother. Mama listened while I explained everything, and I could hear her heart breaking through the phone. "Baby girl, you know I'd take you if I could," she said, her voice thick with tears. "But there's barely room for me in this place, and 3 babies." She trailed off, both of us knowing the truth. There was nowhere for us to go. "What about your cousin LaShonda in Birmingham?" Mama suggested. Maybe she could help temporarily. But LaShonda had 5 kids of her own and a husband who'd just lost his job. Temporary help wasn't going to solve the permanent problem of rebuilding my life with no resources and no support system. That's when Richard delivered the final blow. 5 days before our eviction date, he showed up with his lawyer and a social worker. While his lawyer explained that he was concerned about the children's welfare given my housing instability, the social worker walked through the mansion taking notes about how I was failing to maintain appropriate living conditions. The house was spotless, the children were clean and fed, but none of that mattered. What mattered was that I couldn't afford to keep us there, and Richard was using my poverty against me as evidence that I was an inadequate mother. "We're not seeking full custody," his lawyer explained while Richard stood silent, avoiding my eyes. "But we do think it would be better for the children to live with their father until you're more established. You'll have supervised visitation, of course." I watched the social worker writing notes about unstable housing and financial insecurity and realized this had been planned from the beginning. Richard wasn't just divorcing me, he was taking my children too. Using the very poverty he'd created by throwing us out as justification for keeping the babies away from me. "You can't do this," I said, my voice cracking. "They're my children. I've never hurt them, never neglected them. Being poor doesn't make me a bad mother." "No," Richard said quietly, finally looking at me. "But being unable to provide for them does make me a better option." On April 14th, the day before our eviction, I packed everything that mattered into my old Honda Civic, the car I'd driven before I married Richard, the one I'd kept in the garage like a safety net I'd hoped never to need. 3 car seats, diaper bags, toys, clothes, and my nursing textbooks. Everything else, the furniture, the decorations, the wedding china, stayed behind like remnants of someone else's life. The triplets cried as I buckled them into their car seats, confused about why we were leaving their home, why Daddy wasn't coming with us, why Mommy was crying too. I had nowhere to drive except away, no plan except survival, no hope except the desperate faith that somehow, I would find a way to get my babies back. As I pulled out of the circular driveway for the last time, I saw Jessica Walsh's white Mercedes pulling in. Blonde, beautiful, pregnant with Richard's legitimate child. She didn't even look at me as we passed, and I realized I had been completely erased from the life I'd tried so hard to build. But as I drove away from the mansion where I'd lost everything, something harder than heartbreak settled in my chest. Something that felt like anger and determination, and the kind of dangerous calm that comes right before a storm. Richard thought he could discard me like I was nothing. His family thought they could erase me from their perfect picture. They all thought that destroying my life would make theirs better. They had no idea they'd just made the biggest mistake of their lives. Living in your car with 3 toddlers isn't something you can prepare for, no matter how much you think you understand poverty. The first night, parked behind a 24-hour Walmart, I tried to make it feel like an adventure. "We're camping," I told Zara, Maya, and Kai as I arranged blankets in the back seat. Like explorers discovering new places. But toddlers don't stay fooled for long. By the 3rd night, when Maya woke up crying because she was cold and Kai needed a diaper change, but I'd run out of wipes, the reality of our situation hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't temporary. This wasn't a rough patch we'd laugh about later. This was survival, and I was failing at it. The Honda Civic that had seemed like salvation now felt like a prison. 3 car seats took up most of the back seat, leaving barely enough room for our belongings. A cooler with whatever food I could afford sat in the front passenger seat, mostly crackers and peanut butter because they didn't spoil. The trunk held garbage bags full of clothes, diapers when I could afford them, and the few toys I'd managed to save. During the day, I drove to libraries for air conditioning and clean bathrooms. The children's sections became our living rooms, where the triplets could play while I searched for jobs on the computers and tried to figure out how other single mothers survived. Librarians would give me sympathetic looks when I stayed too long, but they never kicked us out. Small mercy in a world that suddenly felt full of locked doors. At night, I rotated between different parking lots, trying not to stay anywhere long enough to attract attention. Walmart, 24-hour gas stations, hospital parking garages where my old nursing uniform helped me blend in. I learned which places had security guards who'd knock on your window and which ones looked the other way as long as you kept moving. The hardest part wasn't the discomfort or even the constant fear of being discovered. The hardest part was watching my children's confusion turn into resignation. Zara, who had always been the most talkative, stopped asking when we were going home. Maya, my little dancer, stopped spinning and twirling the way she used to in the mansion's big rooms. Kai, my climber, had no stairs to conquer, no playground equipment to master. They were adapting to a life no 3-year-old should have to adapt to, and it was breaking my heart in ways I didn't know were possible. 2 weeks into our homeless stint, I finally found work at a nursing home in Douglasville, 40 minutes from Atlanta. The pay was barely above minimum wage, but they were desperate for certified nurses and didn't ask too many questions about my situation. The administrator, Mrs. Chin, was a kind woman who noticed my exhaustion, but offered solutions instead of judgment. "There's a daycare center next door," she told me on my first day. "They take children as young as 18 months, and they offer sliding scale payments for healthcare workers. It's not perfect, but it might help." Help was an understatement. Little Angel's Daycare became our lifeline. The director, Miss Sarah, was a young Black woman who took one look at my 3 babies and somehow understood exactly what we were going through. When I explained our situation, tears streaming down my face because I was so tired of being strong, she wrapped me in a hug and said, "We're going to figure this out together." The sliding scale payment meant I paid $50 a week instead of $300. Miss Sarah also happened to have extra snacks and juice boxes that the triplets could take home, and she never questioned why I sometimes picked them up 30 minutes after closing because I'd gotten held up in traffic between the nursing home and daycare. For the first time in weeks, I had hope. I was working, the children were safe during the day, and I was slowly saving money. Not much, maybe $100 a week after gas, food, and daycare, but enough to start thinking about a deposit on a small apartment. That hope lasted exactly 3 weeks. Richard's lawyer called on a Friday afternoon while I was at work. The triplets were scheduled for their first supervised visitation that weekend, 2 hours at a family center downtown with a social worker present. I thought it was progress, a sign that the courts recognized I was getting back on my feet. Instead, it was a trap. When I arrived at the family center with the children, clean and dressed in the best clothes I could afford, Richard was waiting with his lawyer and a new social worker I'd never seen before. The children ran to their father, and for a moment, watching him hug them, I remembered why I'd fallen in love with him. He still looked at them with genuine affection, still smiled when Kai showed him a drawing from daycare. But that affection disappeared the moment the social worker started asking questions. "Ms. Montgomery," the new social worker, Mrs. Graham, said while making notes on her clipboard, "I understand you're currently living in your vehicle with the children?" I felt my face burn with shame, even though I had nothing to be ashamed of. "Temporarily, yes. I'm working and saving for an apartment." "And where do the children sleep?" "In the car, but I make sure they're safe and comfortable. I have blankets, and we go to libraries and restaurants during the day for bathrooms and meals." Richard's lawyer leaned forward. "Your Honor had expressed concerns about housing stability. Has that situation improved?" The formal language made it clear this wasn't just a visitation check-in. This was evidence gathering. Every question was designed to document my inadequacy as a mother, to build their case for why Richard should have full custody. "I'm working at Sunset Manor Nursing Home," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. 40 hours a week. The children are in an excellent daycare center, and I'm saving money for an apartment deposit." "How much have you saved?" Mrs. Graham asked. "About $600. It felt pathetic saying it out loud, but I'd worked so hard for that money. "And what's the typical deposit for an apartment suitable for you and 3 children?" I wanted to lie, to say I'd found something affordable, but they probably already knew the truth. Most places want first month's rent, last month's rent, and a security deposit. For a 2-bedroom apartment, that's usually around $3,000. "So you're currently $2,400 short of stable housing?" "Yes, but I'm working toward it. Every week I get closer." That's when Richard spoke for the first time. "Your Honor, I want what's best for my children. They shouldn't have to live in a car while their mother works toward basic housing. Jessica and I have a 4-bedroom house with a yard, excellent schools in the district, and we can provide immediate stability. Jessica. Even hearing her name made my stomach twist. I'd seen pictures of her in Richard's social media posts. Blonde, polished, pregnant, everything I apparently wasn't. Richard had moved her into the mansion 2 weeks after I'd been evicted, and they were planning a wedding for June. His new life was progressing beautifully while mine fell apart. Additionally, Richard's lawyer continued, "We have concerns about Ms. Montgomery's ability to maintain employment while caring for 3 young children alone. She's already missed several scheduled visitations due to work conflicts." That was a lie. I'd missed one visitation because my car had broken down and I couldn't afford the towing fee until my next paycheck. But the way they presented it made me sound unreliable and neglectful. "We're requesting that the children remain with Mr. Ashford during the week and Ms. Montgomery have supervised weekend visitation until she can demonstrate stable housing and consistent income." The words hit me like physical blows. They wanted to take my babies away during the week, let me see them only on weekends like I was some kind of threat to their well-being. Meanwhile, Richard and Jessica would play house with my children, giving them the stability I couldn't provide while making sure I remained the unstable outsider. "This is temporary," Mrs. Graham explained, but her tone suggested she thought it might become permanent. "Once you establish stable housing, we can revisit the arrangement." That night, after saying goodbye to the triplets and watching Richard drive away with them in his luxury SUV, I sat in my Honda Civic and cried until I had no tears left. They were sleeping in their father's mansion while I sat in a parking lot, and the worst part was that it really was better for them. They had beds and toys and food and safety. I had a car and good intentions and $600 that felt like nothing against the mountain of obstacles in front of me. But the cruelty didn't stop there. Richard's family made sure of that. Over the next month, they launched a systematic campaign to prove I was an unfit mother. Caroline would show up at the daycare center, claiming she had a right to see her grandchildren. When Miss Sarah politely explained that only parents and authorized guardians could pick up children, Caroline would make a scene about incompetent staff and inappropriate facilities. Melissa started posting pictures on social media of the triplets during Richard's custody time, but she'd crop me out of older photos and caption them with things like, "So grateful these beautiful babies have stability now," and "Family means everything." Anyone who didn't know our situation would think I'd abandoned my children. The worst part was watching my relationship with the triplets change during our limited weekend visits. They would be excited to see me, but also confused about why I couldn't take them home with me. Kai would ask why I lived in the car, and I'd try to explain it was temporary, but 3-year-olds don't understand temporary. They understand presence and absence, consistency and chaos. Zara, always the most perceptive, started asking if I was sad. "Mommy sad?" she'd say, touching my face with her little hands. I'd force a smile and tell her Mommy was just tired, but I could see in her eyes that she was learning to worry about me the way children shouldn't have to worry about their parents. My work at the nursing home became both salvation and additional stress. The residents were kind, and many of them reminded me of my grandmother who'd raised me to be strong. Mrs. Williams, an 80-year-old former teacher, would listen to my stories during her physical therapy sessions and offer advice that helped me stay sane. "Baby girl," she said one afternoon while I helped her with her exercises, "I've seen women survive worse than this. You think you're broken, but broken things can be fixed stronger than they were before. Don't let them convince you you're defeated when you're just getting started." But even Mrs. Williams' wisdom couldn't solve the practical problems I faced. My car started making ominous noises that I couldn't afford to fix. The daycare center, despite Miss Sarah's kindness, wasn't equipped for overnight care, so I had to pick up the triplets by 6 o'clock even when I was scheduled to work late shifts. Missing work meant missing money I desperately needed. The breaking point came in June, during Richard's wedding weekend. I wasn't invited, obviously, but the wedding was covered in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution Society pages. Prominent attorney marries fellow legal professional in elegant buckhead ceremony. The photos showed Richard and Jessica looking perfect and happy, surrounded by hundreds of guests in a garden ceremony at the country club where I'd never been truly welcome. The article mentioned that Richard had 3 children from a previous relationship, but described Jessica as already embracing her role as stepmother. No mention of me, of course. I'd been erased from the narrative entirely, reduced to a previous relationship, like I was some college girlfriend instead of his wife of 4 years and the mother of his children. But seeing the photos wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the follow-up article a week later about the happy couple's honeymoon in the French Riviera, where they'd taken the triplets for a family bonding experience. My children were in France with their father and his new wife, being introduced to a life of luxury I could never provide, while I sat in a parking lot eating dollar menu burgers and trying to figure out how to stretch $40 until my next paycheck. That's when I realized the truth that had been staring me in the face for months. This wasn't about Richard wanting custody of his children. This was about erasing me completely from their lives. Jessica wasn't just his new wife, she was their new mother. The triplets would grow up calling her Mom, while I became the sad woman they visited on weekends, the cautionary tale about what happens when you don't fit into the Ashford world. Richard had gotten everything: my children, my home, my place in society, my future. And I had nothing except a broken car, a minimum wage job, and weekend visits that felt more like charity than parenthood. But what hurt most wasn't what he'd taken from me. What hurt most was watching my children adapt to their new life so easily. When they came back from France, they spoke excitedly about airplane rides and beach castles and how Miss Jessica had taught them to order room service. They still loved me, but I could see them beginning to understand that Daddy's house was real life and Mommy's car was just an adventure that happened on weekends. Standing outside the daycare center that Friday evening, watching Richard's new Mercedes pull up to collect the children for another weekend I wouldn't see them, I felt something inside me break completely. Not my heart, that had been broken for months. Something deeper. My faith in fairness, in justice, in the idea that doing the right thing eventually leads to right outcomes. The triplets waved goodbye through the car windows, happy and beautiful and slowly forgetting that I was supposed to be their primary parent. Richard didn't even look at me. Jessica, sitting in what used to be my passenger seat, gave me a smile that managed to be both pitying and triumphant. As I walked back to my Honda Civic, my phone buzzed with a text from Richard's lawyer. Ms. Montgomery, we need to discuss modifying the custody arrangement. Please call my office Monday to schedule an appointment. I knew what that meant. They were coming for my weekend visits too. Soon I'd be lucky to see my children once a month, then maybe holidays, then maybe not at all. The Ashford family was patient, methodical, and relentless. They would slowly squeeze me out of my children's lives until I became a memory, a mistake that had been corrected. That night, parked behind a grocery store that closed at midnight, I stared at my reflection in the rearview mirror and didn't recognize the woman looking back at me. Thin from skipped meals, exhausted from working double shifts, defeated by a system that equated wealth with worthiness. The woman I used to be, the one who believed in love and justice and happy endings, was gone. In her place was someone harder, angrier, more desperate. Someone who was starting to understand that playing by the rules only worked if the people making the rules wanted you to win. And the Ashford family definitely didn't want me to win. But as I sat there in the darkness, listening to the distant sound of traffic and thinking about my babies sleeping in beds I'd bought but couldn't visit, something started growing in the empty space where hope used to live. It wasn't hope. Hope was too fragile for what I needed now. It was determination. Cold, calculating determination to find a way back to my children, no matter what it took. I just had no idea that help was about to come from the last place I expected, in a form I never could have imagined. The custody modification hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in July. I had to take unpaid time off from the nursing home, which meant another day without the wages I desperately needed, but there was no choice. Richard's lawyer had made it clear that if I didn't appear, they'd move forward with their request to reduce my visitation to once a month. I spent my last $20 on a blouse from Goodwill, trying to look respectable for the judge who would decide whether I deserved to see my own children. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was dressing up to beg for permission to love my babies, while Richard and Jessica got to play family every single day. The courthouse was the same building where Richard and I had gotten our marriage license 4 years earlier. Back then, we'd been young and hopeful, planning a life together. Now I was walking through the same doors as his opponent, fighting for scraps of time with the children we'd created together. Richard arrived with Jessica, both of them looking like they'd stepped out of a magazine. Jessica was showing her pregnancy now, probably 5 months along, and she had that glow that comes from being financially secure and emotionally supported. Everything I'd had and lost. Richard's hand rested protectively on her back, the same gesture he used to make with me when we faced challenges together. But now I was the challenge. Their lawyer, Mr. Pemberton, was someone I recognized from the country club, old money, old connections, the kind of man who'd never represented anyone who couldn't pay his retainer in full upfront. My court-appointed attorney, Ms. Rodriguez, was young and overworked, handling 30 cases to Pemberton's 5. Your Honor, Pemberton began, my client is requesting a modification to the current custody arrangement due to ongoing concerns about the children's welfare during Ms. Montgomery's visitation periods. He presented a file thick with documentation I'd never seen before. Photos of my car in various parking lots, taken with telephoto lenses like I was some kind of criminal. Records from the daycare showing every time I'd been 5 minutes late for pickup. A psychological evaluation I'd never agreed to, somehow conducted based on observation and available information. Furthermore, Pemberton continued, we have evidence that Ms. Montgomery has been using the children's presence to solicit charity from various organizations, which raises concerns about exploitation. That was a lie so twisted it took my breath away. The charity was the food bank at a local church where I'd taken the triplets once when we were between paychecks. The children had been with me because I couldn't afford a babysitter, and yes, I'd been grateful for the assistance, but I'd never used them to manipulate anyone. But the way Pemberton presented it made me sound like someone who exploited her children's poverty for personal gain. Ms. Rodriguez did her best to defend me, but she was fighting with legal briefs, while they had private investigators and character witnesses. Mrs. Chen from the nursing home testified about my work ethic, and Miss Sarah spoke about how well the children were developing in daycare, but their words felt small against the mountain of evidence Richard's team had compiled. The most damaging testimony came from Dr. Harrison, a child psychologist who'd apparently observed the triplets during their visits with Richard. He'd never spoken to me, never evaluated my parenting, but he had plenty to say about the children's emotional responses to transitions between homes. The children exhibit signs of stress associated with instability, he testified. They're more settled and secure in their father's home environment. The frequent transitions to an unstable living situation appear to be causing developmental delays in emotional regulation. Developmental delays. The words hit me like a slap. My children were fine, happy, healthy, normal 3-year-olds dealing with an abnormal situation. But this man was suggesting that my love was somehow damaging them. When it was my turn to testify, Pemberton tore me apart with surgical precision. How much money did I make? Where exactly was I living? How many jobs had I applied for? Why hadn't I moved in with family members? Had I considered that my children might be better off in a stable environment? Every answer made me sound more inadequate. Yes, I lived in my car, but I was working toward an apartment. Yes, my income was low, but I was a skilled nurse who would advance with time. Yes, I could have moved in with relatives, but that would have meant leaving Atlanta and the job I'd finally secured. Ms. Montgomery, Pemberton said, his voice taking on a tone of false sympathy, isn't it true that you're asking this court to prioritize your desire to see your children over their need for stability? No, I said, my voice shaking. I'm asking this court to recognize that children need their mother and that being poor doesn't make me a bad parent. But being unable to provide basic housing does make you an inadequate parent, doesn't it? Ms. Rodriguez objected, but the damage was done. I could see it in the judge's face, in the way she looked at me with a mixture of pity and disappointment. Another single mother who couldn't get her life together, asking the court to enable her dysfunction at her children's expense. The ruling came down 2 hours later. Visitation reduced to twice a month, supervised only, pending housing stability and financial improvement. Richard had won again, and my children had lost their mother. Walking out of that courthouse, I felt something break inside me that I didn't think could be repaired. The system I'd believed in, the justice I'd counted on, the fairness I'd trusted, all of it was designed to protect people like Richard and Jessica while discarding people like me. But the worst was yet to come. That weekend was supposed to be my first supervised visitation under the new arrangement. I arrived at the family center with a bag of small gifts I'd scraped together, coloring books from the dollar store, stickers, a package of cookies they loved. I'd spent an hour getting ready, wanting to look like the kind of mother who deserved more time with her children. The social worker, Mrs. Graham, met me in the lobby with an expression I couldn't read. "Ms. Montgomery, I'm afraid there's been a complication." "What kind of complication?" "Mr. Ashford called this morning. The children are ill, some kind of stomach flu. He doesn't want to risk exposing you or having them travel while they're not feeling well." My heart sank. "Are they okay? Do they need anything? I could bring them soup, or—" "I'm sure their father has everything under control. We'll reschedule for next weekend." But next weekend, the triplets were at a family reunion in Savannah. The weekend after that, Kai had an ear infection. Then it was Maya's birthday party, a celebration I wasn't invited to but read about on social media, complete with pictures of my children blowing out candles on a cake that spelled out "Happy 4th Birthday" in pink frosting. I realized what was happening. Richard wasn't technically violating the court order. He always had legitimate reasons for canceling visits. But those legitimate reasons were happening awfully frequently and always at the last minute, preventing me from making other plans or finding work opportunities. It was psychological warfare designed to make me feel like an outsider in my children's lives while maintaining legal innocence. And it was working. By August, I'd seen the triplets exactly twice in 6 weeks. They were starting to forget our routines, our jokes, our special songs. When I did see them, they seemed distant, distracted, like I was someone familiar but not quite family. They talked about Jessica's cooking, Jessica's bedtime stories, Jessica's plans for their first day of preschool. Jessica, who had never carried them for 9 months or walked the floors with them when they were sick or taught them their first words. Jessica, who got to be their daily mother while I became their occasional visitor. The final insult came in September. I was working an evening shift at the nursing home when Miss Sarah called me, her voice tight with anger. "Nia, you need to know what just happened. Jessica Walsh came to pick up the triplets today." My blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" "They're not scheduled to be with Richard until Friday. She had paperwork saying she was authorized to pick them up for a doctor's appointment." Legal guardianship papers. Legal guardianship. The words made my stomach drop. "What kind of papers?" "I'm not sure, but they looked official. She said there was some kind of emergency custody modification, and she needed to collect them immediately." I hung up and called Ms. Rodriguez, but her office was closed. I called Richard's phone and got voicemail. I called his parents' house and Caroline hung up on me. Finally, desperate and panicked, I drove to the mansion. Jessica's white Mercedes was in the driveway next to Richard's BMW. Through the windows, I could see lights on in what used to be the children's playroom. My babies were in there, probably getting ready for bed in the house that used to be ours, being tucked in by a woman who had stolen my entire life. I sat in my car outside the gates, crying and shaking and feeling completely powerless. They had my children, my home, my husband, and now apparently legal authority to make decisions about my babies without even consulting me. That's when I noticed the security camera pointed directly at my car. They were probably watching me have my breakdown, documenting my unstable behavior for their next court filing. Another piece of evidence that I was unfit, that Jessica was the better choice, that my children were safer without their biological mother in their lives. I drove away before the police arrived to move me along for loitering, but I knew I'd lost more than a battle. I'd lost the war. The next morning, I found out exactly how much I'd lost. The emergency custody modification had been filed and approved based on allegations that I'd made threats against Jessica and the children's safety. The evidence was my presence outside their home the night before, characterized as stalking and intimidation rather than a desperate mother trying to understand why her children had been taken. My visitation was suspended indefinitely pending a psychological evaluation and anger management classes. I was also served with a restraining order that prevented me from coming within 500 feet of Richard, Jessica, the children, their school, or the mansion. In less than 6 months, I'd gone from being a wife and mother to being legally prohibited from seeing my own children. The Ashford family had played a perfect game, using the legal system to systematically destroy me while maintaining their image as concerned parents protecting their grandchildren from an unstable woman. That night, parked behind a closed restaurant with nowhere to go and no one to call, I stared at the restraining order and felt something die inside me. Not hope. I'd killed that myself weeks ago. Something deeper. My faith in the possibility that good people who work hard and love deeply can overcome injustice through perseverance and righteousness. The world wasn't fair. The system wasn't just. And sometimes the people with money and power win simply because they have money and power, not because they deserve to. But as I sat there in the darkness, surrounded by the wreckage of my life, I made myself a promise. This wasn't over. Somehow, someday, I would find a way to get my children back. I would find a way to make Richard and his family pay for what they'd done to us. I just had no idea that my chance for justice was about to walk into a soup kitchen on a cold October night, recognizing me as the nurse who had once shown him kindness when he needed it most. October in Atlanta brought the kind of cold that cuts through thin clothes and settles in your bones. I'd been living in my car for 6 months now, and winter was coming whether I was ready for it or not. The Honda's heater had given up weeks ago, joining the long list of things in my life that had broken beyond my ability to fix. I hadn't seen the triplets in over a month. The psychological evaluation required for my visitation rights cost $800 that I didn't have, and the anger management classes were another $300. Even if I could afford them, the earliest appointment wasn't until December. By then, my babies would have been living with Jessica longer than they'd lived with me after the divorce. She would be their primary attachment figure, their real mother in everything but biology. The thought made me physically sick. Work at the nursing home had become my only anchor to sanity. Mrs. Williams, the former teacher who'd become my unofficial therapist, had taken a turn for the worse after a stroke, but she still tried to lift my spirits during her physical therapy sessions. "Baby girl," she whispered one afternoon when I was helping her with her exercises, "you look like you're disappearing. When's the last time you ate a real meal?" I couldn't remember. Food had become fuel, something to keep me functioning rather than something to enjoy. Most days I survived on whatever was cheapest at the gas station, crackers, instant noodles, occasionally a banana if I was feeling optimistic about nutrition. "I'm fine, Mrs. Williams. Just focused on getting back on my feet." She squeezed my hand with more strength than I expected. "Listen to me carefully. I've lived through the Depression, Jim Crow, civil rights, and more heartbreak than one woman should bear. I know what rock bottom looks like, and you're staring up at it from somewhere much deeper." Her words stayed with me as I finished my shift and drove aimlessly through the streets of Atlanta. It was Friday night, which meant Richard and Jessica were probably having dinner with the triplets, maybe reading bedtime stories, definitely living the family life that should have been mine. I found myself driving past the mansion without meaning to. The restraining order meant I couldn't stop, couldn't even slow down, but I could see the warm lights in the windows as I passed. Halloween decorations covered the front yard, carved pumpkins, friendly ghosts hanging from trees, a scarecrow that looked like something from a magazine spread. The triplets loved Halloween. Last year, we'd spent weeks planning their costumes. Zara wanted to be a princess, Maya chose a butterfly, and Kai insisted on being a dinosaur. I'd stayed up late 3 nights in a row hand-sewing details that would make their costumes special. We'd practice trick-or-treating in the hallway of the mansion, with Richard and me taking turns being the neighbors who gave out candy. This year, they'd probably have store-bought costumes that cost more than my monthly food budget. Professional quality outfits that looked perfect in photos, but had no love sewn into them, no late-night mother's touch that made them unique. As I drove past the house, I caught a glimpse of movement in the living room window. A blonde woman, Jessica, was sitting on the couch reading to 3 small figures in pajamas. My children, having story time with their new mother while their real mother drove by like a stranger in the night. The image broke something in me that I thought was already completely shattered. I drove to the 24-hour diner where I sometimes bought coffee when I needed to warm up and use a bathroom that didn't require asking permission. The waitress, a middle-aged woman named Betty who'd seen me there before, took pity on me and brought me a bowl of soup I hadn't ordered. "On the house, honey," she said quietly. "You look like you need it." I wanted to cry at her kindness, but I'd cried so much over the past months that the tears felt used up. Instead, I sat in the corner booth and tried to make the soup last as long as possible, both for the warmth and because this was the nicest place I'd be all day. That's when I overheard the conversation that would destroy what little hope I had left. 2 booths behind me, a woman was talking loudly on her phone, apparently thinking the diner was empty enough for a private conversation. I recognized the voice before I turned around, Melissa Ashford, Richard's sister, the one who'd spent my entire marriage treating me like hired help. No, the timeline worked perfectly," she was saying, laughing like she was sharing the punchline of a hilarious joke. Jessica was already 3 months pregnant when Richard filed for divorce. We just had to make sure Nia didn't find out until after the custody hearing. My blood turned to ice. I sat frozen, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, afraid that any sound would stop this conversation that was revealing truths I wasn't sure I wanted to know. "Mother was brilliant about it," Melissa continued. "She hired that private investigator to document Nia's instability, starting in January, 2 months before Richard even told her about the divorce. We had everything ready, photos, financial records, character witnesses. The whole thing was planned like a military operation." January. They'd been planning to destroy me since January, for months before Richard had walked into our kitchen with divorce papers. For months of gathering evidence, building a case, preparing to take my children away from me while I was still trying to be a good wife and mother. "The best part was how easy it was to manipulate her into looking unstable," Melissa said, and I could hear the cruelty in her voice. "Every time she fought back, every time she tried to defend herself, we used it as evidence that she was unfit. The woman literally helped us build the case against her." My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my coffee cup. Every memory from the past year was recontextualizing itself in my mind. Caroline's surprise visits that always seemed to happen when I was struggling with the children. Richard's sudden business trips that left me overwhelmed and exhausted. The social worker who appeared at the mansion that day, supposedly responding to community concerns about the children's welfare. It had all been orchestrated. Every moment of chaos, every instance of me looking like I couldn't handle motherhood, every piece of evidence that made me seem unfit, it was all planned. "Jessica was perfect for the role," Melissa continued. "Law degree, right family background, already pregnant so Richard could prove he was capable of maintaining appropriate relationships. She knew the plan from the beginning, seduce him, get pregnant, and help us get rid of the mistake he'd made with the black girl. The mistake. That's what I was to them. Not a woman, not a wife, not the mother of their grandchildren. A mistake that needed to be corrected. And the best part is that Nia will never be able to prove any of it. Everything we did was legal. We used the system exactly the way it's designed to work, to protect families like ours from people like her. I felt like I was going to vomit. The room was spinning, and I could barely catch my breath. Everything I'd been through, every moment of self-doubt and self-blame, every time I'd wondered if maybe I really was an inadequate mother, it was all orchestrated by people who saw my existence as a problem to be solved. But Melissa wasn't done destroying me yet. The money situation was genius too, she said, and I could hear her getting excited, like she was describing her favorite movie. Richard moved all their savings into accounts under his name only, then claimed Nia was financially irresponsible when she couldn't afford basic necessities. We made her poverty look like personal failure instead of deliberate sabotage. The savings. Our savings. The money I'd contributed from my nursing job, the money we'd saved together for the children's future, the money that should have helped me get back on my feet after the divorce. Richard had stolen it all, and then used my resulting poverty as evidence that I couldn't provide for my children. Mother's favorite part was the restraining order, Melissa continued. We knew Nia would eventually show up at the house when she got desperate enough to see her kids. The security cameras were already in place, and Jessica had the emergency custody papers ready to file. One photo of Nia sitting outside the house, and boom, she looks like a stalker instead of a heartbroken mother. The restraining order that had destroyed my last chance to see my children was based on a trap they'd set for me. They'd known I would come looking for my babies, and they'd used that desperation against me. How long before Jessica adopts them? Melissa asked, and my world stopped completely. The lawyer says 18 months minimum. Nia has to be completely out of the picture first. No visitation, no contact, ideally some kind of documented mental breakdown that proves she's unfit permanently. Then Jessica can file for step-parent adoption, and we can legally erase Nia from their lives forever. Adoption. They wanted Jessica to adopt my children. Not just raise them or act as their stepmother, but legally replace me as their mother. In 18 months, if their plan worked, I would have no legal connection to Zara, Maya, and Kai. They would be Jessica's children, and I would be nothing more than a surrogate who'd served her purpose. The children are already calling her Mama Jess, Melissa said, and each word felt like a knife in my chest. Zara asked last week why they couldn't call her just Mama like normal kids. It won't be long before they forget about Nia completely. My babies were forgetting me. The children I'd carried in my body, nursed through sleepless nights, loved with every breath in my body, they were calling another woman Mama and asking to forget I existed. I stood up too quickly, knocking over my coffee cup and sending hot liquid across the table. Betty looked over with concern, but I couldn't stay another second. I had to get out of there before Melissa saw me, before she realized I'd heard everything, before I completely fell apart in public. I stumbled to my car and drove without seeing, without thinking, without any destination except away. Away from the truth that was too horrible to accept, away from the realization that everything I'd lost had been stolen deliberately, away from the knowledge that my children were being taught to forget their real mother. I ended up in the parking lot of a closed shopping center, sobbing so hard I could barely breathe. Everything I'd believed about my situation was wrong. I wasn't a victim of circumstances or a woman who'd failed to adapt to divorce. I was the target of a systematic campaign to destroy me, planned and executed by people with unlimited resources and no conscience. Richard hadn't fallen out of love with me. He'd never loved me at all. The entire marriage had been a mistake he'd spent 4 years figuring out how to correct, and I'd been too naive and trusting to see it coming. The affair with Jessica hadn't been a moment of weakness or a relationship that developed naturally. It was a calculated decision to replace me with someone more suitable, someone who could give the Ashford family the kind of grandchildren they actually wanted. My children's rejection of me wasn't natural or inevitable. It was manufactured through deliberate isolation and emotional manipulation, designed to make them forget their real mother and bond with their replacement. The worst part was knowing that it was working. In 18 months, if I couldn't find a way to stop them, my children would be Jessica's children legally and emotionally. I would be erased from their lives so completely that they might not even remember my name. As I sat in that parking lot, staring at my reflection in the rearview mirror of a car that was becoming my permanent home, I realized that I had been fighting the wrong battle. I'd been trying to prove I was a good mother, trying to work within a system that was designed to protect me, trying to trust that justice would eventually prevail. But there was no justice for people like me in a world designed for people like them. The system wasn't broken, it was working exactly as intended, protecting the wealthy and powerful while discarding anyone who threatened their perfect picture. Richard and his family had used their money, connections, and legal expertise to systematically destroy everything I cared about. They'd turned my love for my children into a weapon against me, used my desperation to see them as evidence of my instability, and manipulated every aspect of the legal system to ensure their victory. And they were winning. In 18 months, they would have won completely. Unless I found a way to fight back that they hadn't planned for. Unless I found resources they didn't know I had. Unless I stopped playing by rules they'd written to ensure my defeat. But sitting in that parking lot with $17 in my wallet and nowhere to sleep except my car, I couldn't imagine what those resources might be or where I might find them. I had no idea that my salvation was already walking toward me in the form of a man I'd once cared for when he was dying, a man who remembered kindness when the rest of the world had forgotten I existed. I had no idea that sometimes justice doesn't come from courts or lawyers or following the proper procedures. Sometimes justice comes from people who understand what it means to be discarded and decide to use their power differently. But that realization was still hours away. For now, all I had was the devastating knowledge that everything I'd lost had been stolen deliberately, and the growing certainty that if I was going to save my children, I would have to become someone stronger and more ruthless than the woman who'd trusted in fairness and played by the rules. The woman who believed in love conquering all was gone. In her place was someone who understood that sometimes you have to fight fire with fire, and that the people who showed you no mercy don't deserve any in return. The knowledge of what they'd done to me should have made me angry. Instead, it broke something fundamental in my spirit, something that I'm not sure ever fully healed. When you discover that every moment of suffering was deliberately orchestrated by people who smiled at you during Sunday dinners, anger feels too small, too clean. What I felt was closer to a complete unraveling of my understanding of human nature. For 3 days after overhearing Melissa's phone call, I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't even cry anymore. I just drove aimlessly around Atlanta, burning gas I couldn't afford, trying to process the magnitude of what had been done to me and my children. The Honda finally gave up on Tuesday morning. I was sitting in the parking lot of a grocery store, trying to work up the energy to go inside and buy something cheap for breakfast, when the engine made a sound like metal tearing and then went silent forever. When I turned the key, nothing happened. Not even the dying whine of a battery trying to start a broken engine. Just silence. I called the only mechanic I'd been able to afford, a guy named Tommy who ran a garage in East Atlanta and sometimes let people pay in installments. He took one listen to my description and delivered the news I'd been dreading. Sounds like your engine block cracked, probably from overheating. I'm sorry, Nia, but it's gonna cost more to fix than the car's worth. You're looking at maybe $4,000 minimum. $3,000 might as well have been $3 million. I had $47 in my wallet and maybe another $20 in my checking account. The Honda had been my home, my transportation to work, my only connection to any kind of stability. Without it, I had nothing. Tommy, I need this car. I live in it. I can't. I don't have anywhere else to go. I know, sweetheart. I wish I could help, but I can't fix what's broken for free. Maybe you got family who could. No. I hung up before he could finish the thought. My mother was struggling to keep her own head above water. My cousins had their own problems. I'd burned through every favor, every connection, every possible source of help months ago. The tow truck arrived an hour later. I watched them load my car onto the back like they were taking away a coffin. Everything I owned was in that Honda: my clothes, my nursing textbooks, the few photos I'd managed to save from my marriage, a stuffed elephant that Zara had given me for Mother's Day 2 years ago. "Where you want me to take your stuff?" the tow truck driver asked, not unkindly. He'd probably seen this scenario before. I stared at the garbage bags full of my possessions and realized I had no answer. I couldn't afford a storage unit. I had no apartment, no room, no friend with space for a homeless woman and her belongings. Just take it all to the junkyard," I said finally. "I can't carry it." "You sure? Some of this looks important." I watched him gesture toward the bag that contained Zara's elephant and the few baby photos I'd managed to save when Richard threw me out. "I'm sure." As the tow truck drove away with everything I had left in the world, I stood in that grocery store parking lot and felt the last piece of my old life disappear. I wasn't just homeless now. I was completely unmoored from anything that connected me to the person I used to be. Without a car, I couldn't get to work. Without work, I couldn't save money for housing. Without housing, I couldn't regain visitation rights. Without visitation rights, I couldn't fight for my children. It was a perfect trap, designed to ensure that once you fell far enough, you could never climb back out. I called Mrs. Chen at the nursing home from a payphone outside the grocery store, using quarters I'd found in my coat pocket. "Nia, honey, I've been worried about you. You missed your shift yesterday. My car broke down. I can't afford to fix it, and I can't get to work without it." "I'm sorry, Mrs. Chen. I know you needed me." There was a long pause. "Can you take the bus? I could adjust your schedule to match the bus routes." I wanted to say yes, wanted to find a way to make it work, but the reality was too harsh. I don't have anywhere to live anymore. The car was my home. I can't show up to work clean and professional when I'm sleeping on the street. Another pause, longer this time. "Nia, I wish I could help, but I can't have employees who can't maintain basic standards." "I'm sorry. I really am." I understood. She had a business to run, other employees depending on reliable schedules, residents who deserved consistent care. My homelessness wasn't her problem to solve. But understanding didn't make it hurt less when she said, "I'll mail your final paycheck to, well, do you have an address where I can send it?" "No," I whispered. "I don't have an address." "I'll hold it here for you then. You can pick it up whenever you're able." When I hung up that phone, I truly had nothing. No job, no car, no home, no way to see my children, no prospect of improving any of those things. I was a woman with a nursing degree and 4 years of marriage to one of Atlanta's most prominent families, and I was about to join the ranks of people I'd always assumed had made bad choices or suffered from addiction or mental illness. Now I understood that sometimes you can do everything right and still lose everything. Sometimes the system isn't designed to catch you when you fall. Sometimes good people end up on the street not because they failed, but because someone with more power decided they didn't deserve better. That first night sleeping rough was the longest of my life. I found a spot behind a closed restaurant where the dumpster blocked the view from the street, using newspaper I'd found blowing around the parking lot as a blanket. Every sound made me jump: cars passing, cats fighting, the distant sound of sirens that might be coming for me. I'd seen homeless people my entire life, but I'd never understood the fear. The constant vulnerability of having no walls, no locks, no safe space to let your guard down. The way every person who walks past might be a threat, every police car might be trouble, every store owner might decide you're a problem to be moved along. By morning, I was shivering so hard I could barely stand. My nursing uniform was wrinkled and dirty, my hair was a mess, and I smelled like the alley I'd slept in. Looking at my reflection in the restaurant's window, I barely recognized myself. The woman staring back at me looked exactly like the kind of person Richard's family had always said I was: poor, desperate, inappropriate. someone who didn't belong in their world and never had. The next few days blurred together in a haze of hunger, cold, and exhaustion. I learned which public bathrooms stayed open all night, which fast food places would let you sit for hours if you bought a single item, which libraries had comfortable chairs where you could rest during the day. I learned that being homeless makes you invisible in a way that's both blessing and curse. People look through you like you're not there, which means you can often find places to rest or stay warm. But it also means that when you desperately need help, when you're trying to explain that you're not supposed to be here, that this isn't who you really are, no one believes you. The worst part was the dreams. Every night, in whatever doorway or alley or abandoned building I found to sleep in, I dreamed about my children. Sometimes they were looking for me, calling my name, asking why mommy had left them. Sometimes they were older, teenagers who didn't remember my face, living perfect lives with Jessica as their mother. I'd wake up reaching for them, and for a split second I'd forget where I was. Then reality would crash back, the cold concrete, the smell of garbage, the absolute certainty that I was failing them in ways I couldn't even comprehend. A week into my life on the streets, I was approached by a social worker doing outreach for homeless women. She was kind, genuinely caring, and she offered me resources, a shelter that might have space, food assistance programs, job placement services. But when she started asking questions about my situation, I realized how impossible my story sounded. A former wife of a prominent lawyer, living on the street because of a custody dispute? A nurse who'd lost everything because her in-laws orchestrated her downfall? It sounded like delusions of grandeur, the kind of story that mentally ill homeless people tell to make themselves feel better about their circumstances. Have you considered that maybe your memory of these events might be affected by trauma or stress? The social worker asked gently. Sometimes when we lose everything, our minds create explanations that help us cope. Even she thought I was delusional. The conspiracy I'd discovered was so elaborate, so cruel, so perfectly executed that it sounded unbelievable. Who would believe that a wealthy family had spent months planning to destroy one woman's life with military precision? The shelter she recommended had a waiting list 3 months long. The job programs required a permanent address. The assistance programs needed documentation I no longer had. Every resource designed to help people like me required things I couldn't provide because of the thoroughness with which the Ashfords had destroyed my life. But the final blow came 3 weeks into my homelessness, when I saw Richard and Jessica on the local news. I was in a McDonald's, using the Wi-Fi and trying to look busy enough that they wouldn't kick me out when the evening news came on. The story was about a charity gala for children's services, hosted by some of Atlanta's most prominent families. There they were, Richard handsome in his tuxedo, Jessica glowing in a designer gown that probably cost more than I used to make in a month. They were being interviewed about their commitment to helping disadvantaged children and their plans to expand support services for families in crisis. "We believe every child deserves stability and love," Jessica said, her hand resting on her pregnant belly. "My husband and I are passionate about making sure vulnerable children have the resources they need to thrive." My husband. She called him my husband on television, and Richard smiled like he'd never been married to anyone else. Like I'd never existed, like our children had always been hers, like the family they were presenting to the world was the only family that had ever mattered. The reporter asked about their blended family, and Richard's response made me physically ill. "Jessica has been incredible with my children from my previous relationship. They've bonded beautifully, and we're looking forward to officially expanding our family soon." Previous relationship. For years of marriage, 3 children together, and I was reduced to a previous relationship. The babies I'd carried and birthed and loved were now evidence of Jessica's generosity in accepting Richard's baggage. But the worst part was seeing the triplets in the background of the shot, dressed in matching outfits that probably cost more than most people's rent, looking happy and healthy and completely settled in their new life. They were playing with other children at the gala, supervised by nannies, living the kind of privileged existence I'd always known I couldn't provide. They looked fine. Better than fine. They looked like they belonged in that world in a way I never had. Watching them, I almost convinced myself that maybe the Ashfords had been right. Maybe my children really were better off without me. As I sat in that McDonald's, eating a dollar menu burger that I'd made last 3 hours, watching my ex-husband and his new wife accept praise for their charitable work while my children called her mama, I hit a level of despair I didn't know was possible. I wasn't just homeless and jobless and separated from my children. I was erased. Forgotten. Replaced so completely that even I was starting to believe that maybe I deserved what had happened to me. That night, sleeping behind a closed gas station with newspaper for warmth and my purse for a pillow, I seriously considered just disappearing entirely. Walking away from Atlanta, from the fight for my children, from the impossible task of rebuilding a life, from absolutely nothing. Maybe it would be better for everyone if I just gave up. Maybe my children would be happier never knowing what had happened to their birth mother. Maybe Richard and Jessica deserved to win because they could provide things I never could. I was so close to surrender that I could taste it, the relief of stopping the struggle, the peace of accepting defeat, the freedom of walking away from a battle I couldn't win. But as I lay there in the darkness, shivering and broken and ready to quit, I heard something that changed everything. The sound of sirens, getting closer, and then the screech of brakes as an ambulance pulled into the gas station parking lot. I watched the paramedics rush inside to help someone who'd collapsed, and something about their urgency reminded me of why I'd become a nurse in the first place. To help people who needed healing. To be there for others when they had no one else. And I realized that giving up on my children wasn't mercy, it was abandonment. No matter how hopeless things looked, no matter how completely I'd been defeated, my babies needed someone to fight for them. They needed someone who remembered their real mother, who would never stop trying to find a way back to them. Even if I failed. Even if I never saw them again. Even if Jessica raised them and they grew up calling her mama and never knowing my name. They deserved to have someone who refused to give up on them. So instead of walking away, I made myself a different promise. I would find a way to survive this. I would find a way to get stronger. And someday, somehow, I would find a way to make the people who destroyed my life pay for what they'd done. I had no idea that help was about to come from someone who understood exactly what it felt like to be discarded by people who saw you as disposable. Someone who remembered what it meant to be treated with dignity when everyone else saw only your weaknesses. But that salvation was still hours away. For now, all I had was my refusal to surrender and a determination forged in the fires of absolute loss. It would have to be enough. November in Atlanta brought the kind of bone-deep cold that made sleeping outside feel like slow torture. I'd been homeless for 6 weeks, and my body was starting to give up in ways that scared me. The persistent cough that had started as a minor irritation was getting worse, and I'd lost so much weight that my clothes hung off me like I was a child playing dress-up in adult clothing. But it was the mental exhaustion that nearly broke me. The constant vigilance of staying safe, the daily humiliation of being seen as a problem to be moved along, the crushing weight of knowing that somewhere across town, my children were eating dinner with a woman they called Mama while their real mother searched through dumpsters for something edible. The soup kitchen at St. Mark's Episcopal Church served meals on Tuesday and Friday evenings. I'd resisted going there for weeks because some part of me still believed this was temporary, that accepting charity would make my situation more real. But when you haven't eaten a hot meal in 4 days, pride becomes a luxury you can't afford. The line was already wrapped around the block when I arrived that Friday night. Men who looked like they'd been living rough for years, women with children clinging to their legs, elderly people who shouldn't have been on the street but somehow were. All of us united by the basic human need for food and warmth. I kept my head down, not wanting to make eye contact with anyone who might recognize me. Atlanta isn't that big a city, and even though I'd been erased from the social circles I used to move in, there was always a chance someone might remember Richard Ashford's first wife. The last thing I needed was for word to get back to his family that I was this far gone. The church volunteers were kind but efficient, serving plates of beef stew, bread rolls, and vegetables to anyone who needed them. No questions asked, no judgment in their eyes, just basic human compassion that I'd forgotten existed. When it was my turn, an elderly volunteer with gentle eyes smiled at me and said, "God bless you, dear. There's coffee and dessert over by the wall if you want seconds." I found a spot at a table in the corner, next to a woman with 3 young children who reminded me painfully of my own babies. She was trying to get her youngest to eat while managing the other 2, the kind of juggling act I remembered from those early days with the triplets. "How old are they?" I asked, partly because I was lonely and partly because talking to someone might stop me from thinking about where Zara, Maya, and Kai were eating dinner tonight. 2, 4, and 6, she said, exhaustion clear in her voice. "We've been staying at the shelter, but they can only keep families for 30 days. Time's almost up. Where will you go?" She shrugged, the gesture of someone who'd run out of options. "Don't know yet. My mama's got her own problems, and my sister's place is too small. Maybe we'll figure something out." Looking at her children, clean and well-behaved despite their circumstances, I saw myself 6 months ago. A mother doing everything possible to protect her babies, fighting a system that seemed designed to separate families instead of keeping them together. "You're a good mother," I told her. "I can see it in how they look at you. Whatever happens, don't let anyone tell you different." She smiled, the first genuine expression I'd seen from her. "Thank you. That means more than you know." That's when I heard a voice behind me that made my blood freeze. "Nia? Nia Montgomery." I turned slowly, praying I was wrong, praying it wasn't someone who would remember me from my old life and spread word about how far I'd fallen. Instead, I found myself looking at a man I almost didn't recognize, thin, wearing simple clothes, with the kind of weariness that comes from serious illness. But the eyes were familiar. Kind eyes that had looked at me with gratitude during some of the hardest moments of his life. "Mr. Harrison?" I whispered, recognizing him despite how much he'd changed. "Edward Harrison?" He smiled, and suddenly I could see the man I'd known 2 years ago, before the second round of cancer had taken so much weight from his frame. Edward Harrison, tech entrepreneur turned philanthropist, who'd spent 3 months in our cancer ward when his lymphoma came back with a vengeance. But what was he doing at a soup kitchen? The Edward Harrison I'd known was worth hundreds of millions of dollars, the kind of man who had his assistant handle charitable donations rather than ladling soup himself. "I can't believe it's you," he said, sitting down across from me without invitation. "I've thought about you so many times over the past 2 years. You probably don't remember, but you were my nurse during the worst time of my life. Remember?" How could I forget? Edward had been different from most of our wealthy patients. Instead of treating the nursing staff like servants, he'd learned our names, asked about our families, brought coffee for the night shift. When his treatment made him too sick to eat, I'd spent extra time finding foods that didn't make him nauseous. When he couldn't sleep because of the steroids, I'd sit with him during my breaks and listen to him talk about his fears. "Of course I remember," I said, my voice cracking. "You were one of my favorite patients. You treated us like human beings instead of hired help. You saved my life," he said simply. "Not just medically, though you caught that infection before it became sepsis. Emotionally. You talked to me like I was still a person instead of a dying man. You gave me dignity when I felt like I had nothing left." I started crying then, not the dramatic sobs I'd become used to, but quiet tears of recognition. Someone remembered me as something other than a problem or a failure. Someone saw me as the person I used to be. "Edward, what are you doing here?" I asked, gesturing around the soup kitchen. "I volunteer here twice a week," he said. After my recovery, I realized how much time I'd spent writing checks instead of actually helping people. Money's easy to give when you have it. Time and presence are more valuable. He paused, studying my face with the careful attention I remembered from his hospital stays. "The better question is, what are you doing here? Last I heard, you'd married well and left nursing." The shame hit me like a physical blow. How could I explain to this successful, respected man that I was homeless, that I'd lost my children, that I was so far from the competent nurse he remembered that I barely recognized myself? It's complicated, I said, staring at my hands. Complicated how? Something in his tone reminded me of our late-night conversations in the hospital, when the pain medication made him honest and the darkness made me brave. We'd talked about real things then, his fear of dying, my dreams of making a difference, the ways that wealth and poverty shaped people's options. So I told him everything. The marriage to Richard, the systematic campaign to destroy me, the custody battle, the homelessness. All of it in whispered sentences that felt like confessing sins I hadn't committed. Edward listened without interruption, his expression growing darker with each detail. When I finished, he was quiet for so long I thought maybe he didn't believe me. Maybe he thought I was just another homeless person with delusions of having once been something more. "Those bastards," he said finally, his voice carrying a cold anger I'd never heard from him before. "Those absolute bastards. You believe me? Nia, I've met people like the Ashfords my entire career. Old money families who think their wealth gives them the right to destroy anyone who threatens their perfect image. What they did to you isn't unusual, it's just usually more subtle." He leaned forward, his eyes intense in a way that reminded me he hadn't built his fortune by being passive. "Tell me about your children. How old are they now?" I showed him the one photo I'd managed to keep, crumpled and faded from being carried in my pocket. 3 beautiful 4-year-olds at their last birthday party, before everything fell apart. "They're beautiful," he said, studying their faces. "They look like you. That's the problem." Richard's family wanted grandchildren who looked like them. My babies were too dark, too obviously mixed. They were embarrassed by their own grandchildren. Edward's joy tightened. And now? They live with Richard and his new wife. Jessica's adopting them next year, and I'll be erased from their lives completely. They probably don't even remember me anymore. Do you want them back? The question was so simple, so direct, that it caught me off guard. Everyone else had asked if I thought it was best for the children or whether I could provide adequate care. Edward was the first person to ask what I wanted. "More than I want to breathe," I whispered. "Then we're going to get them back." "Edward, you don't understand. They have money, lawyers, connections. I have nothing. I can't even afford a place to live, much less fight a custody battle against one of Atlanta's most powerful families." He smiled then, the same smile I remembered from the hospital when he decided to fight the cancer instead of accepting defeat. "Nia, do you remember what I told you during my darkest night in the hospital? When I thought I was going to die and leave my company to executives who didn't care about anything except profit?" I did remember. He'd been delirious from fever, talking about how his wealth felt meaningless if he couldn't use it to make the world better. How he wanted to find ways to help people who reminded him of the nurses who'd saved his life with their compassion. "You said you wanted to use your money to fight for people who couldn't fight for themselves." "Exactly. And you, Nia Montgomery, are exactly the kind of person I was talking about." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card, writing something on the back. "I want you to go to this address tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. Ask for Janet Mitchell. She's my personal assistant. Tell her I sent you." "Edward, I can't accept charity." "I appreciate the offer, but..." "This isn't charity," he said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone I imagined he used in boardrooms. "This is justice. And justice, done properly, requires resources." He stood up, then paused and looked back at me. "Nia, I need you to understand something. What happened to you wasn't your fault. You didn't lose your children because you were a bad mother or because you made poor choices. You lost them because wealthy, powerful people decided you were inconvenient and used the system to crush you. I know that now, but knowing doesn't change anything." "It changes everything," he said firmly. "Because now you're going to stop fighting their fight and start fighting your own. No more playing by rules they wrote to ensure your defeat. No more accepting their narrative about who you are and what you deserve." He handed me the card. Tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock. Your life is about to change, Nia. The question is whether you're ready to let it. As he walked away, I stared at the business card in my hands. On the front was the logo for Harrison Foundation, one of the largest charitable organizations in the Southeast. On the back, in Edward's handwriting, were the words, Emergency Intervention, Full Authorization, EH. The woman with 3 children was looking at me with curious eyes. Was that Edward Harrison? Like, the billionaire Edward Harrison? I think so, I said, still staring at the card. Girl, what did he give you? I honestly didn't know. But for the first time in months, I felt something I'd forgotten how to feel. Hope. Not the desperate hope of someone drowning and grasping at straws, but the solid hope of someone who suddenly understands that the game can be changed if you find the right allies. That night, I slept in the church basement with permission from the pastor who'd been watching our conversation. It was warm and safe, and for the first time since losing my car, I slept through the night without waking up afraid. In the morning, I used the church bathroom to wash up as thoroughly as possible and put on the cleanest clothes I had. I didn't know what waited for me at the Harrison Foundation, but I knew it was my only chance to change the trajectory of my life. As I walked toward downtown Atlanta, I made myself a promise. Whatever Edward was offering, whatever opportunity was waiting for me, I would grab it with both hands and never let go. I was done being a victim. I was done accepting defeat. The Ashford family had won every battle so far because they'd been fighting a woman who believed in fairness and played by the rules. But that woman was gone, destroyed by their cruelty and systematic abuse. In her place was someone harder, someone who understood that sometimes you have to fight fire with fire, someone who was ready to use whatever weapons were available to get her children back. I didn't know what those weapons might be, but I was about to find out. And once I had them, Richard and his family were going to discover exactly what they'd created when they tried to destroy someone who had nothing left to lose. The Harrison Foundation occupied 3 floors of a gleaming downtown Atlanta high-rise. As I rode the elevator to the 28th floor, I caught my reflection in the polished steel doors and almost didn't recognize myself. The homeless woman from the soup kitchen was still there in the hollow cheeks and too-thin frame, but something else had appeared overnight. A hardness around my eyes, a set to my jaw that hadn't been there before. Janet Mitchell was exactly what I'd expected from a billionaire's personal assistant, impeccably dressed, efficiently kind, and clearly accustomed to handling unusual requests from her boss. She took one look at Edward's business card and ushered me into a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Mr. Harrison will be with you shortly, she said, offering me coffee and pastries that I tried not to devour too obviously. He asked me to prepare some preliminary paperwork while you wait. 10 minutes later, Edward walked in looking more like the man I remembered from the hospital, well-dressed, energetic, carrying the confidence that comes from having unlimited resources and the knowledge of how to use them. Nia, he said, sitting across from me at the polished conference table. I spent most of last night thinking about our conversation, and I've made a decision that's going to change both of our lives. He opened a folder and spread out documents I couldn't immediately understand. Legal papers, financial statements, corporate filings that might as well have been written in a foreign language. Do you remember our conversation about justice and using wealth to help people who can't help themselves? Of course. Good. Because I'm about to offer you something that will sound impossible, but I need you to trust me completely. He leaned forward, his expression serious in a way that reminded me of doctors delivering life-changing diagnoses. Nia, I'm going to give you $240 million. The words didn't make sense. I heard them, but my brain couldn't process them as reality. I'm sorry, what? $240 million. Not a loan, not charity, not something you'll ever have to pay back. It's yours, free and clear, to use however you see fit. I started laughing, the kind of hysterical laughter that comes when stress breaks your ability to process information normally. Edward, that's not possible. Nobody gives away that much money. Especially not to homeless women they met in soup kitchens. Actually, people like me give away that much money all the time. We just usually give it to universities that name buildings after us or charities that throw galas in our honor. This time, I'm giving it to someone who will use it for something I care about more than my legacy." He pulled out another set of documents. The money comes with ownership stakes in 12 different companies, including 3 that do business with Richard's law firm. It comes with a seat on the board of 2 major Atlanta charities. It comes with social connections that will make you one of the most influential women in this city. My head was spinning. Edward, this is insane. Why would you do this? Because 2 years ago, when I was dying in a hospital bed, you were the only person who treated me like a human being instead of a bank account. You held my hand when I was scared. You brought me books when I was bored. You fought the doctors when they wanted to give up on me. He paused, his voice getting quieter. Do you remember what you told me the night before my last surgery? When I said I was afraid I'd wasted my life accumulating money instead of making a difference. I did remember. He'd been convinced he was going to die, and he was crying about all the ways he'd failed to use his wealth meaningfully. I'd told him it wasn't too late, that as long as he was breathing, he could still choose to be the person he wanted to be. You said it's never too late to become who you're supposed to be. That money is just a tool, and tools can be used to build or destroy depending on who's holding them. I remember. Well, now I'm putting that tool in the hands of someone I trust to use it for justice instead of ego. Someone who understands what it feels like to be crushed by people with power and who won't abuse that power when she has it. I stared at the documents, my mind racing through implications I couldn't quite grasp. Edward, I don't understand how this works. You can't just give someone $250 million. There are laws, taxes, regulations. All handled, Janet Mitchell said, speaking for the first time since Edward arrived. We've structured it as a combination of gifts, charitable distributions, and business partnerships that are completely legal and minimize tax implications. The money will be in accounts under your name by this afternoon. This afternoon? My voice cracked. Today? Edward smiled. Today. Because yesterday you were powerless, and tomorrow you're going to start dismantling the system that destroyed your life. He opened another folder, this one containing photographs and documents I recognized with growing excitement. I also spent last night having some very interesting conversations with private investigators, former employees of Richard's law firm, and journalists who've been looking into the Ashford family's business practices for years. The first photograph showed Richard and Jessica at the charity gala I'd seen on the news, but this wasn't the flattering coverage from the society pages. This was a surveillance photo taken from across the room, showing Richard's hand on the waist of a young associate while Jessica was turned away. Richard's already cheating on his pregnant wife, Edward said matter-of-factly. Apparently, he has a pattern of pursuing younger women at his firm. Jessica is just the latest in a long line of replacements. The next document was a financial audit of Ashford and Associates. Their law firm is hemorrhaging money. They've been covering it up with creative accounting, but they're about 6 months away from bankruptcy. Turns out that driving away clients because of racist family attitudes isn't great for business. More documents, more revelations. The Ashford family's real estate holdings were leveraged to the hilt. Caroline's art collection was mostly forgeries. Melissa's husband had gambling debts that were threatening their marriage. The family that seemed so powerful, so untouchable, is actually barely holding on, Edward explained. They destroyed your life because they needed a scapegoat for their own failures. Richard's divorce from you wasn't about finding someone better. It was about finding someone whose family could bail them out financially. I stared at the evidence of their vulnerabilities, feeling something dark and satisfying growing in my chest. Jessica's family has money? Jessica's father owns 3 manufacturing companies and a shipping business. The marriage wasn't just about getting rid of you. It was about saving the Ashford empire through strategic alliance. Edward leaned back in his chair, watching my face as I processed everything. Now, here's what's going to happen. You're going to use your new resources to systematically expose every lie they've told, every law they've bent, every person they've destroyed. And you're going to do it publicly, in a way that ensures they can never rebuild what they've lost. He handed me one final document. This is a purchase agreement for Ashford and Associates. As of noon today, you will own Richard's law firm. You will also own the building where they rent office space, the country club where they hold their social events, and the bank that holds the mortgages on their properties. You're buying his law firm? You are buying his law firm. With your money. Money that gives you the power to fire Richard, evict his family from their properties, and ensure that everyone who helped destroy your life faces consequences for their actions. I looked at all the documents, all the evidence, all the tools for revenge that had been placed in my hands. 6 months ago, I'd been sleeping in my car with 3 babies, begging Richard for mercy. Today, I was about to become his boss. There's one more thing, Edward said, his voice taking on a tone I couldn't quite read. I've arranged for a little reunion this afternoon. Richard, Jessica, and his entire family will be at the law firm for what they think is a meeting with potential investors. Instead, they're going to meet their new owner. Today? This is all happening today. Justice delayed is justice denied, he said simply. You've suffered long enough. It's time for them to face the consequences of what they've done. Janet Mitchell placed a tablet in front of me, showing bank account balances that made my eyes water. $240 million, really and truly mine, sitting in accounts with my name on them. The car service is waiting downstairs, Edward said, standing up. Your new legal team is already at the law firm, along with representatives from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, Channel 11 News, and 3 social media influencers who specialize in exposing wealthy families who abuse their power. The media will be there? Everything they did to you was designed to be public humiliation disguised as legal proceedings. It's only fair that their downfall be equally public. As we rode the elevator down to the lobby, I caught my reflection again in the polished doors. The homeless woman was still there, but now she was wearing power like armor. Money didn't erase what I'd been through, but it sure as hell gave me the tools to make sure no one else would have to go through it. The car service was a black Mercedes that probably cost more than most people's houses. As we drove through downtown Atlanta toward the offices of Ashford and Associates, I thought about my children. Somewhere across the city, they were probably in preschool, playing with toys and learning songs, and having no idea that their mother was about to reclaim the power to fight for them. Edward, I said as we pulled up to the building that would soon be mine, what happens after today? After I destroy them? After today, you rebuild, he said simply. You get your children back, you use your resources to help other women in similar situations, and you prove that sometimes the good guys really do win. He paused as the driver opened my door. But first, you walk into that building and show Richard Ashford exactly who he tried to destroy. You show him what happens when you underestimate someone who has nothing left to lose and everything to gain. As I stepped out of the Mercedes and looked up at the building where Richard worked, where he'd built his career on the backs of people he considered beneath him, I felt something I hadn't experienced in almost a year. Power. Real, tangible, overwhelming power. The homeless woman who'd eaten soup kitchen meals last night was gone. In her place stood someone with the resources to rewrite the rules of the game, someone who understood exactly how to use wealth and influence to protect the people she loved and punish the people who'd tried to destroy her. Richard and his family were about to learn that when you push someone past their breaking point, you don't create a victim. You create a force of nature. And this force of nature was about to storm into their perfect world and tear it apart piece by piece, just like they'd done to mine. The only difference was that when I was finished, they wouldn't have the resources to rebuild. They'd have nothing except the knowledge that their destruction was justice, finally served. I walked through the glass doors of Ashford and Associates for the first time as its owner, and I couldn't wait to see the look on Richard's face when he realized that the woman he'd thrown away like garbage was about to become his judge, jury, and executioner. The elevator ride to the 20th floor of what was now my building felt like ascending to a different universe. 24 hours ago, I'd been sleeping behind a gas station. Now I owned a downtown Atlanta high-rise and was about to walk into a boardroom as the most powerful person in the room. My new legal team was waiting in the lobby, 3 attorneys from the most prestigious firm in the city, along with Edward's head of security and a woman I didn't recognize who introduced herself as Margaret Chin, investigative journalist. We've been tracking the Ashford family's financial irregularities for 2 years, Margaret explained as we walked toward the conference room. Your story is the missing piece that proves everything we suspected about their business practices. Through the glass walls of the conference room, I could see them all gathered around the polished table where Richard had probably made thousands of decisions about other people's lives. Caroline sat at the head like a queen holding court, Melissa beside her typing something on her phone, Richard looking confident and relaxed in his expensive suit. And Jessica, pregnant, glowing, sitting in the chair that probably cost more than my old monthly rent, completely unaware that the life she'd stolen was about to be reclaimed. They were all there, the people who had systematically destroyed my existence, waiting for what they thought would be another business meeting that would solidify their wealth and power. Instead, they were about to meet their reckoning. Are you ready? Edward asked, his hand on the conference room door. I thought about my children, somewhere across the city, calling another woman mama while their real mother prepared to tear down the people who'd stolen them. I thought about every night I'd slept in my car, every meal I'd skipped, every moment of humiliation and despair I'd endured because of the people sitting in that room. I've been ready for months, I said. Edward opened the door and I walked into the conference room like I owned it, which I literally did. The silence was immediate and absolute. 5 faces turned toward me with expressions that ranged from confusion to horror, but it was Richard's face that I focused on. The color drained from his features as he tried to process what he was seeing. Hello, Richard, I said, taking the seat at the head of the table that Caroline vacated without being asked. I hope you don't mind me joining your meeting. After all, it is my building now. Caroline was the first to recover her voice. What is this? Some kind of joke? Security should remove this woman immediately. Actually, said James Patterson, the lead attorney from my legal team, Ms. Montgomery is the new owner of this building and this law firm. As of noon today, she has the authority to remove anyone she chooses. I watched Richard's face as the implications hit him. His ex-wife, the woman he'd made homeless, was now his boss. The woman he'd discarded like garbage was now sitting in his mother's chair, holding his professional life in her hands. That's impossible, Melissa said, but her voice lacked conviction. She's homeless. She is nothing. Had nothing, I corrected. Past tense. Present tense, I have resources you can't even imagine. I opened the folder that Margaret Chin handed me and spread out documents across the table. Financial records, recorded conversations, photographs, legal filings that painted a picture of systematic fraud and conspiracy. Let's start with the most interesting discovery, I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. The private investigator you hired to document my instability was also recording your planning sessions. Did you know that, Caroline? I played the first audio clip, Melissa's voice clear as day. Mother was brilliant about it. She hired that private investigator to document Nia's instability, starting in January, 2 months before Richard even told her about the divorce. The color drained from Melissa's face as her own words filled the room. Richard looked at his mother with something approaching horror, like he was realizing for the first time the full extent of what had been done in his name. The whole thing was planned like a military operation. The recording continued, Melissa's laughter audible as she described using my desperation against me. This is taken out of context, Caroline said, but her voice was shaking now. Is it? Let's hear more. I played the second clip, the one where Melissa described Jessica's pregnancy timeline and how they'd planned to use it against me. I watched Jessica's face crumble as she realized that her fairy tale romance had been a calculated business transaction designed to destroy another woman's life. Richard, Jessica whispered, looking at her husband with betrayal in her eyes. You told me you fell out of love with her naturally. You said our relationship developed organically. It did, Richard said weakly, but the recordings were proving otherwise. The third clip was the most damaging, Caroline discussing the financial manipulation, the deliberate isolation, the plan to make me so desperate that I'd do something they could use against me in court. We made her poverty look like personal failure instead of deliberate sabotage, Melissa's voice explained to whoever she'd been talking to that night at the diner. You stole our joint savings, I said to Richard, my voice getting stronger with each revelation. Money I'd earned working as a nurse, money we'd saved together for our children's future. You took it all and then used my resulting poverty as evidence that I was an unfit mother. Nia, I'm not finished. I opened another folder. Let's talk about the custody case. The psychological evaluation I supposedly agreed to but never signed off on. The social worker who observed the children without my knowledge. The emergency custody modification based on fabricated evidence. Margaret Chin stepped forward with her own folder. We've been investigating family court corruption for years. The judge who handled your case has financial ties to 3 different law firms that have represented the Ashford family. The social worker received a $50,000 donation to her son's private school from an anonymous donor the week after she testified against you. That's bribery, Jessica said, apparently still naive enough to be shocked by the extent of the corruption. That's Tuesday for families like this, I replied. They buy whatever they need, judges, social workers, expert witnesses. They turn the legal system into their personal weapon against people who inconvenience them. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the city where I'd lost everything and was now reclaiming it all. But here's the thing about corruption. It's only powerful when it's hidden. Once you drag it into the light, it dies pretty quickly. What do you want? Richard asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I want my children back. I want full custody, with you getting supervised visitation until you prove you can be a decent father instead of a pawn in your family's racist games. And if I refuse? I smiled, the expression feeling foreign on my face after months of despair. You're not in a position to refuse. You work for me now. Your family's properties are mortgaged through banks I now have controlling interests in. Your country club membership depends on board members who answer to me. I opened the final folder, revealing the most devastating evidence of all. But mostly, you can't refuse because tomorrow morning, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution is running a front-page story about the systematic destruction of a young mother by one of Atlanta's most prominent families. Complete with recordings, financial documents, and testimony from everyone you've hurt over the years. You can't do that, Caroline said, but she sounded defeated. I already have. The story's been filed, the editors have approved it, and by tomorrow afternoon, everyone in Atlanta will know exactly what kind of people you really are. Margaret Chin opened her laptop and turned it toward the table. We've also prepared a detailed investigation for broadcast news and social media. Turns out, when you give people the resources to fight back, they tend to uncover a lot of interesting information. The screen showed documents detailing years of discriminatory practices at Richard's law firm, evidence of the family using their wealth to silence previous victims, financial records proving they'd been bleeding money for years while maintaining a facade of prosperity. Your law firm has been systematically excluding Black attorneys and clients, I continued. You've used your influence to prevent other mixed-race families from joining your country club. You've donated money to political candidates who oppose housing equality and school integration. We are not racist, Caroline said, but the words sounded hollow even to her. Really? Then why did you cut your own granddaughter's hair because it was too wild? Why did you tell Richard he needed children who would fit better into your family legacy? Why did you spend months planning to erase a Black woman from her children's lives? The room was silent except for the sound of Jessica crying. She was finally understanding that her perfect new life had been built on the deliberate destruction of another woman's family. Richard, she said through her tears, how could you let them do this? How could you help them take those babies away from their mother? I thought it was for the best, he said weakly. I thought the children would be better off with stability. You thought they'd be better off without their black mother, I corrected. You thought they'd be more acceptable to your racist family if they were raised by a white woman who could help them pass. I sat back down at the head of the table, in the position of power I'd never expected to occupy. But here's what's going to happen now. You're going to sign custody papers giving me full legal and physical custody of Zara, Maya, and Kai. You're going to move out of the mansion that I'm buying from your family's creditors. You're going to resign from every board, every committee, every position of influence you've used to hurt other people. And if we refuse? Melissa asked. Then tomorrow's newspaper story will be just the beginning. I have enough evidence to pursue criminal charges for fraud, bribery, conspiracy, and child endangerment. I have enough financial leverage to foreclose on every property your family owns. I have enough social influence to make sure you're never accepted in polite society again. I leaned forward, letting them see the steel in my eyes that months of suffering had forged. You taught me how power really works in this city. You showed me that money and connections matter more than justice or fairness or basic human decency. Thank you for the education. Caroline looked at me with something approaching respect for the first time since I'd known her. You've become quite formidable. You made me formidable. Every cruelty, every humiliation, every moment you tried to break me just made me stronger. You created your own worst nightmare, someone who understands your weaknesses and has the resources to exploit them. The custody papers were signed within an hour. Richard's resignation from the law firm was effective immediately. The family's agreement to sell their properties to my shell companies was notarized before they left the building. But the most satisfying moment came when Jessica approached me as the meeting was ending. "I'm sorry," she said, her pregnant belly visible beneath her designer dress. "I didn't know how they'd treated you. I believed Richard when he said you'd been an unstable mother who'd abandoned your children. Did you ever try to find out the truth? Did you ever ask to meet the woman whose children you were raising?" She shook her head, ashamed. "I thought it would be better for everyone if I just focused on being the best mother I could be. Those children have a mother. They have a mother who carried them for 9 months, who walked the floors with them when they were sick, who loved them more than her own life. You were just keeping them warm until she could get back to them." "What's going to happen to us?" she asked, one hand on her belly. "That depends on you," I said honestly. "If you help with the transition, if you support the children's relationship with their real mother, if you testify truthfully about what this family did to me, then you can be part of their lives as Richard's wife and their stepmother. And if I don't? Then you'll learn what it feels like to be erased from children's lives by people with more power than you have." That afternoon, I drove to the daycare center where my children had been enrolled by their father and stepmother. Miss Sarah was still working there, and when she saw me walking through the doors in a tailored suit instead of homeless rags, her face lit up with joy and confusion. "Nia? Girl, what happened to you? You look like you own the world." "I own enough of it," I said, smiling for the first time in months. "I'm here to pick up my children." The legal paperwork was already in order. Edward's attorneys had made sure every document was filed, every signature was notarized, every bureaucratic requirement was met. Within 2 hours, I was legally and physically reunited with Zara, Maya, and Kai. They were cautious at first, confused about why Mama Jess wasn't picking them up, uncertain about this woman who looked familiar but felt like a stranger. 4-year-olds don't understand custody battles or systematic oppression. They just know when their routine changes and their world shifts. But when I knelt down to their level and started singing the lullaby I used to sing to them every night, something clicked. Zara's face lit up with recognition, and she threw her arms around my neck. "Mama," she said, the word I'd been desperate to hear for months. "You came back." "I never left, baby," I whispered, holding all 3 of them as they remembered who I was. "Mama never left. I just had to go away for a while to figure out how to come home." That night, we slept in a hotel suite that cost more per night than I used to spend on groceries in a month. The children curled up next to me in the king-sized bed, their warm little bodies pressed against mine like they were afraid I might disappear again. "Mama," Kai said as I tucked him in, "are we going to live with you now?" "Forever and always," I promised. "No one is ever going to take you away from me again." The next morning, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution ran their front-page story, "Prominent Atlanta Family Accused of Systematic Abuse of Power." By afternoon, the story had been picked up by national news outlets. By evening, #JusticeForNia was trending on social media. The public response was swift and devastating for the Ashford family. Richard's law firm lost half its clients within a week. The country club revoked their membership. Former friends and business associates distanced themselves as quickly as possible. But the most satisfying consequence was watching their financial empire crumble. Without Jessica's family money to prop them up, and with their own resources seized to pay legal judgments, the Ashfords went from wealthy to bankrupt in less than 6 months. Caroline lost the mansion that had been in her family for 4 generations. Melissa's husband left her when the gambling debts became public. Richard moved into a modest apartment and took a job at a public defender's office, the only legal position he could find after his disgrace. Jessica divorced him before their baby was born, citing irreconcilable differences and emotional cruelty. She kept her maiden name, moved back to her parents' house, and started therapy to process how she'd been manipulated into participating in the destruction of another woman's family. But my focus wasn't on their downfall. My focus was on rebuilding. I bought a house in a good neighborhood with excellent schools, close enough to Edward's foundation that I could work there part-time while still being present for my children. I enrolled Zara, Maya, and Kai in a diverse, progressive school where their mixed heritage was celebrated instead of hidden. Most importantly, I used my resources to start the Montgomery Foundation, dedicated to helping other women who'd been systematically abused by wealthy families using the legal system as a weapon. We provided legal representation, financial support, and housing assistance to women fighting custody battles against powerful opponents. In our first year, we helped 67 women regain custody of their children. We exposed 4 judges who were taking bribes from wealthy families. We successfully lobbied for legislation requiring family court judges to disclose their financial connections to parties in custody cases. Edward served on our board of directors, along with Margaret Chin, Miss Sarah from the daycare center, and Mrs. Williams from the nursing home, who had recovered enough from her stroke to become our fiercest advocate for healthcare worker rights. But the most rewarding part of my new life was watching my children heal and grow. They adjusted to our new reality with the resilience that children have when they feel truly loved and secure. They still saw Richard on weekends, in supervised visits that gradually became less supervised as he proved he could prioritize their well-being over his family's expectations. The mansion where I'd lost everything became a transitional housing facility for homeless women with children. I kept the children's playroom exactly as it had been, but now it served dozens of kids whose mothers were getting back on their feet instead of 3 children whose mother had been systematically destroyed. Caroline never forgave me for what she called my vindictive revenge, but I didn't care about her forgiveness. I cared about justice, and justice meant making sure that what happened to me couldn't happen to other women. 2 years after that night in the soup kitchen when Edward recognized me, I was invited to speak at a conference for family law attorneys about systemic abuse in custody cases. Standing at that podium, looking out at hundreds of lawyers and judges and social workers, I thought about how far I'd traveled from the broken woman who'd once slept in her car. The system worked exactly as it was designed to work, I told them. It protected wealth and privilege while discarding anyone who threatened the established order. The question isn't whether the system is broken, it's whether we're brave enough to fix it. After my speech, a young Black woman approached me with tears in her eyes. "My ex-husband's family is trying to take my son away," she said. "They're using the same tactics you described. I don't know what to do." I handed her my business card. "Come see me Monday morning. You're not fighting this alone anymore." That's what my life has become. using the power that was meant to destroy me to protect other women from the same destruction. Every case we win, every family we reunite, every corrupt official we expose is proof that sometimes the arc of justice really does bend toward righteousness. But it only bends when someone with the resources and determination to bend it decides that enough is enough. My children are 6 years old now, happy and healthy and surrounded by people who love them for exactly who they are. They know their story, how their mother lost everything and fought to get it back, how their father learned to choose love over prejudice, how their grandmother's cruelty ultimately led to justice for many families. They're proud of who they are, proud of their mixed heritage, proud of their mother who refused to stay down when powerful people tried to destroy her. They understand that money and power can be used for good or evil, and they're already planning how they'll use their advantages to help other kids when they grow up. Richard and I have developed something approaching a functional co-parenting relationship. He's in therapy, learning to recognize the racist conditioning that made him complicit in his family's cruelty. He's also remarried to a woman he met at the public defender's office who shares his newfound commitment to justice instead of status. Jessica and I have become unlikely allies in raising children who understand both privilege and justice. Her daughter from Richard is growing up knowing her older sibling's story, learning early that family isn't just about biology, but about choice and commitment and love. Edward remains one of my closest friends and advisors. We meet monthly to discuss new ways to use wealth for justice, new strategies for helping people who've been systematically oppressed, new opportunities to prove that money can be a force for good when it's in the right hands. But the most important lesson I've learned is that strength isn't about never falling down. Strength is about getting back up after you've been knocked down, learning from the fall, and using that knowledge to make sure others don't have to fall as far as you did. The Ashford family tried to erase me from my children's lives and from society itself. Instead, they created someone who understands exactly how power works and isn't afraid to use it for justice. They thought they were destroying a naive young woman who believed in fairness. What they actually did was forge someone who understands that fairness is something you fight for, not something you wait for. And that fight continues every day, with every woman we help, every family we reunite, every corrupt system we expose and reform. Because justice isn't a destination, it's a daily choice to use whatever power you have to protect people who have less power than you do. Hey everyone, thank you so much for sticking with me through this entire journey. I hope my story reminds you that no matter how dark things get, no matter how powerless you feel, there's always a way forward if you refuse to give up on what matters most. If this story touched you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more content about overcoming impossible odds and fighting for justice. Share it with someone who needs to hear that their current circumstances don't determine their future possibilities. And remember, you're stronger than you know, more valuable than anyone who's ever made you feel worthless, and more powerful than any system designed to keep you down. Your story isn't over yet. It's just getting started. Until next time, keep fighting, keep believing, and keep proving that love and justice will always win in the end, even when it takes longer than we hoped. Much love from Atlanta, where impossible dreams really do come true when you refuse to accept defeat.